Hello, everyone. Good morning, and good morning to those in Brisbane and around the country and around the world, wherever people are zooming in from. Welcome. We'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country that we're meeting on. For those of us in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, pay respects to elders past and present, and recognise especially this week the first anniversary of the defeat of the Voice referendum, the importance of maintaining connection to country, maintaining respect, and maintaining commitment to social justice. And social justice is a little bit of a bridge into what we're going to be hearing about today from our two guest speakers, Wendy Steele and Tony Milne. The theme of today's session is on mobilising change, insights into building individual and collective support for climate action. The format for today is our two speakers will each speak for about 15 minutes, following which I'll invite both of them to comment on the other's presentation, and then we'll open up for Q&A online and live. So our first speaker today is Professor Wendy Steele, who's a Professor of Sustainability and Urban Governance in the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT University, and is also co-chair of Future Earth Australia. Her research focuses mostly on the nature of cities, the role of citizens, in climate action, climate change, with an emphasis on critical urban infrastructure and climate justice. Widely published many books, the most recent of which has got the evocative title of Hot Cities, a Transdisciplinary Agenda. Wendy's also a founding member of the Planetary Civics Inquiry and has been working closely with many other colleagues here and elsewhere to promote sustainability and climate action through a focus on regenerative urban futures. And with a bit of luck, all the technology is set to go. So welcome, Wendy.
Thanks very much, Ian, and hi, everyone. I would also like to acknowledge that I am living and working on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my sincere respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and as an urban researcher, the impact of the built environment is really significant. So it's a very important agenda to acknowledge, respect and work towards changing. I was particularly pleased to be invited to this seminar because I'm passionate about transdisciplinary research and the ways in which different disciplines can come together with other stakeholders and particularly First Nations leaders and knowledge systems to take action on climate change. So those shared conversations are at the heart of what I'd like to talk about today. So almost 2 decades ago, US author and environmentalist Bill McKibben wrote about what he saw as a form of cognitive dissonance, a paradox, as he put it, associated with climate change. And in his words, one species, ours, has by itself in the course of a couple of generations managed to powerfully raise the temperature of an entire planet and knock its most basic systems out of kilter. But oddly, although we know about it, we don't know about it. So one reason for this, he argued, was that despite the overwhelming scientific evidence, climate change has yet to register culturally. It has yet to really enter our imaginative and affective realms. And Rob Nixon extended this further by arguing that we actually have a representational deficit in how we portray and comprehend the invisible and yet devastating consequences of the climate impacts that we're seeing through environmental, cultural, social, and planetary level destruction. So my work sits at the nexus of environmental humanities and the social sciences. And as a critical urban governance scholar, I've been involved in a number of different levels of working around climate action, so planetary civics, national urban policy, local government and metropolitan scale governance. But particularly, I think my heartlands lies in looking at what is happening within communities at the local scale and within place-based contexts in bioregions that are very specific and have a history in and of themselves. So working with other colleagues on social innovation at the local scale, working with colleagues around Hot Cities, a transdisciplinary agenda, and more recently around the Routledge Handbook of Grassroots Climate Activism, which brought together international scholars who have been focused on different activist movements around the world, has really emphasised a range of different types of actions that are taking place at different scales and in different modes. And we've been listening to stories, and storytelling is at the heart of this. And I want to highlight a couple of stories, particularly focused around some of our artists as activists that were part of this important conversation. So one of these artists who was part of a group called the Muses Trio, they're composers, classical composers, and they were brought together by the ABC to come up with music in the wake of the Australian summer bushfires that would speak to, engage and mobilise people's emotions around how they were feeling in the wake of those really significant experiences. And this is one of the quotes that she said, Teresa, when interviewed. At home in Brisbane, it flooded again. I can't stop crying. My nearly 5-year-old doesn't want to play outside inside of the piles of debris lining the streets. I'm weeping for the irrevocable damage that is taking place to our collective future on our watch. I'm infuriated by the fear-generating lies, misinformation and confusion on climate dominating the only daily newspaper, by the ever-revolving door of politics, media and fossil fuel companies who quietly delay any real action on climate change, while Australia is receiving more and more criticism from the international community. We don't want to know what the unprecedented future looks like. I believe, and this is in her words, that the arts have the power to engage, to move, to connect, and through storytelling, emotional connection, and the communal experience of the power of live performances, we can keep those critical conversations alive. We can begin to shift the stifling mindset of the powerless and the isolated individual and move towards the animated and activated community and civic realm. I found this extremely powerful, and it really resonated with me in terms of being a bit more hopeful about what positive examples of change we can look to, ways to reduce heat and stay cool, ways to rethink policy and planning, ways to engender more equitable ways of living sustainably with the earth, which is itself an alive system that needs care, repair and restoration. Learning from Indigenous and First Nations knowledge and leadership around earth-centred and cosmological visions of community as an intimate interaction between mind, spirit and physical landscapes. And the radically inclusive notion of life and well-being that is both dynamic and relationally interconnected to more than human entities. So Tyson Yunkaporta describes this as creation in the sense that this is about something we collectively create, not an event in the distant past, but something that is continually unfolding and needs custodians to keep co-creating it by linking the two worlds together in cultural practice. So he's particularly talking about the ways in which we might engage with our colonial presence and our prefigurative and regenerative futures, building on Indigenous knowledge systems. So Rebecca Solnit, author and thinker, reminds us in her book, Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories and Wild Possibilities, that the sleeping giant of radical change, and I'm particularly interested in change around climate change, is civil society. The superpower whose non-violent means, and we recognise that sometimes there are groups that proactively engage in violent demonstration, but I personally and the groups that I work with are focused on non-violent means, are sometimes for a shining moment more powerful than violence regimes and armies. And we write history with our feet and with our presence and our collective voice and our visions. So the work that I did with Donna Houston, Jason Byrne, Dinah McCallum and Jean Hillier was focused on the ways in which ordinary people are taking extraordinary actions to create change. And this in no way replaces the need for wider spread politics, the need for demonstrations in terms of marches and other forms of nonviolent protest. But it's making the case for the importance and significance of daily nurturing and action that mobilises, connects and builds bridges to other movements in which we believe we will see the sort of change that we need. So we worked across the community at the local scale, so not-for-profits, local government. We spoke to private business owners. We were really interested in the ways in which they were trying to do things differently. And we were specifically interested in local scale, socially innovative activities, that is, activities that take and rearrange and reshape the sort of governance and social practice structures that we have taken for granted, that underpin much of the unsustainable cities and urban life that we are part of. New imaginaries through the arts, but storytelling in its broader realm. Prefigurative care practices. So what are the care practices we can already see in these communities that can help show us the path for the future? And creative making and doing that's intentional, not accidental. Accidental is fine, but we're really interested in purposeful action on climate change. And a number of examples just, to show you the sort of wealth of work that's happening. We have different groups like A Climate for Change. They do kitchen table discussions with local neighbourhoods and communities. They help people enable them to feel more confident about making submissions to local government and other entities so that they can become a sort of shared and communal voice, a force for seeing the sorts of changes that they want to see. A private, eco-private consortium called Eco-Burbia in Perth, which is setting itself up as a demonstration site. So whilst it's privately owned, they seek to show how you can live in a different way that is more sustainable, that is more regenerative. They invite people in, they do tours, they run workshops as a way of engaging the community collectively in that manner. And of course, a much celebrated and well-known example of the city of Darebin, which was one of the first to announce a climate emergency here in Melbourne, and really instigated the Solar Saver program, which helped to financially support pensioners and those older citizens on a low income to take out, to be able to put solar panels on their roofs to address energy poverty, which they had identified as being a real issue within their communities. And that's since been uptaken by many other councils, not only in Australia, but around the world. And just noting that in Melbourne, there is a really interesting example where councils share knowledge and skills. So they don't try and replicate the same thing across councils, but they're actively working to build different skill sets and then share those as a collective across the metropolitan region, which again, I think is just another example of where they're trying to do things differently. And just bring it back to the arts context, artists have a really strong and powerful role in shaping public discourse, but in connecting with the emotions of individuals and communities as they seek to navigate through these difficult, uncertain and very precarious times. So this is, some of you may recognise it, but it's the work of Anne Noble, who's an artist from New Zealand. She in one of her many curatorial roles, had an exhibition that focused specifically on portraits of dead bees. And in her fine grain, these are large photographs. And what she does is invite people to engage with these images of posthumous bees, and in doing so, share in a sort of more than human mourning for, what the future might be. So it's sort of like a museum for the future in climate change, but pointing to where we don't want to end up. And there's something that's not loud or shocking about it. It's profound in its sort of quiet devastation, if you like, and it can be very moving. I would really urge you can find it online if you want to look at examples, more examples of the work that she's tried to engage with. So so there are lots of different ways that we can look at climate action, and we've talked about, and building on the work of others, the need to scale out, which means to work across the different networks that are happening at the local scale and connect, collaborate, not compete around the ways in which we can come together, not always agree. I think there's recognition of diversity within the wonderful world in which we inhabit, but build bridges towards progressive change. Obviously scale up, but also scale deep. So this is, without being corny, about hearts and minds, but it's about connecting deeply with values and how they might build again those bridges to shared futures. Ian Lowe, a colleague of mine who I worked with at Griffith University some years ago, wrote a book called Living in the Hothouse, and he describes the effect of global warming as a shared journey experienced across the world in every strata of society and every single day. And we need to attend to IPCC reports, work that's going on at the UN, and that level of political, international, planetary scale engagement. But we also need to look at the creative community practices, the ways in which hope can arise in even the darkest and hottest spaces of the climate crisis. When looking into darkness, as Rebecca Solnit argues, we often transform the future's unknowability into something that can be a little more certain, and we can have the fulfillment of all our dread, the place beyond which there is no way forward. We can become overwhelmed by doubt, despair, and powerlessness. But she says that we can actually challenge that as well. If we surrender and abandon hope, then we are abandoning the future. And so she said citizen action is the key, and that underpins all of the work that we're involved in. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm just going to finish with one more quote from one of the musicians from the Muses Trio, and we can play a bit of that music right at the end if anyone is interested, because it's quite beautiful classical music. But they argued that the decisions we're making now determine the problems that we face in the future. And political awareness is important, but so is the reformation of community and community arts and activism to survive these devastating circumstances. Exploring, exposing ideas across and between and amongst our societies, creating projects that showcase the way different people are enacting change in climate change. This becomes the basis for creative conversations. It becomes the basis for shared learning. And that's what we're passionately committed to advancing. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy, and all done with 1 minute and 11 seconds to spare. Excellent. So online, we'll save questions till after the next speaker, who is Tony Milne, who's got a very varied, interesting career, starting at the very south end of New Zealand, I think, planning a career with an English degree, then quickly graduated into working in social justice and political action, including for the Helen Clark Labor government in New Zealand, and then continuing that sort of work in Australia, where he is currently the Executive Officer of the Carlton Neighbourhood Learning Centre in Melbourne. So welcome, Tony.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Tony Milne tōku ingoa, ko Lorna Milne tōku mama, ko Bob Milne tōku papa, tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, or the mana whenua, as we would say in New Zealand, the people of the land, and also acknowledge Ian and Wendy, and everyone who is here today in Melbourne and everyone that is online as well. So my slide starts off a little bit provocative, and there is a story behind this slide. Let's see, is this going to work? So part of my talk today is about our ability to create change. So the science is clear, the solutions are there, but we're still struggling to act at the scale that is required. What if the real barriers to climate action are not technical or scientific, but psychological, social, political? And what role do we all have in enabling or blocking that change? So back to my first slide. When I was thinking about this presentation, I came across a conversation that was happening in my workplace. our community development manager was speaking with our farmer about climate change. And I didn't overhear the whole conversation, but I asked her later to tell me a little bit about what they were talking about. And she opened that conversation with the words that were in the start of my presentation, which I'm not going to repeat because I don't really use foul language that often. But she is someone who's worked in climate change and climate advocacy for 35 plus years. She was at the vanguard of this issue, doing the Al Gore climate presentations, working to create change for many years. And yet she is feeling overwhelming despair at the state that we're in terms of climate change and the lack of climate action, and looking at the science and what the scientists and researchers are saying, and is feeling overwhelming despair. And despair is one of the major barriers to change, because we need to have a sense of hope if we are to act and to create change. And yet at the same time, that despair is rational and logical given what we are facing and the news that we're presented with each and every day. But if that despair is replicated across a movement, you can see why it is a significant barrier to change. So I'm going to quickly present some news that I came across just in the last week alone. So climate change isn't something in the future. Climate change is here and now. We are already seeing the impacts. The year 2023 was the warmest on record and broke every other climate indicator. So this was an article just from the last week. We're seeing the collapse of ecosystems, severe drought, more severe storms, heat killing hundreds of thousands each year, and mass species extinction. We're already experiencing this. Another headline from just this week: temporarily overshooting global climate targets could be more damaging than predicted. The scientists are saying the best outcome the world could now hope for is 1.6 degrees of warming by 2100, and that's the very most optimistic projections. Just yesterday, I was in the middle of a climate change workshop at Yarra City Council. We were doing the adaptation game, which is a great board game that's been developed to work with local communities about community resilience and adaptation to climate change. And this headline popped up on my phone in the middle of that presentation: global water crisis leaves half of world food production at risk in the next 25 years. I don't know about you, I'm overwhelmed by that headline. Like it feels so bleak. So you can understand why people working in this space in climate activism can feel such a sense of grief and despair about what is happening. Scientists are saying that to save ecosystems that supply fresh water is urgent when half of the world is already facing water scarcity. Another headline, this is just Australian media, just from the last week: Earth's vital signs show humanity's future in the balance, say climate experts. Record emissions, temperatures and population mean more scientists are looking into the possibility of societal collapse. More and more scientists are looking into that possibility, and they've assessed the 35 vital signs in 2023 and found 25 worse than ever recorded. I hope I'm not bringing you all down. It is quite bleak stuff. Climate warning: as world's rivers dry up at the fastest rate for 30 years. Rivers dried up at the highest rate in 3 decades in 2023, putting global water supply at risk, data has shown. Another headline from this week: extreme heat is the deadliest weather disaster. Hundreds of thousands of people die from extreme temperatures every year, more than any other type of weather disaster. And the Secretary General of the UN has said Earth is becoming hotter and more dangerous for everyone every year. And just finishing up with 2 slides. Now, I'm not a big fan of facts and stats because I know from research that facts and figures are not persuasive. So don't look too much at the numbers, but look at what story these graphs are telling us in terms of the human impact, carbon emissions. And I hate even the term carbon emissions because it doesn't say what it is. We are poisoning our air We are poisoning our water. We are poisoning our land. We are pumping poison into our atmosphere, which is changing and has changed our climate. That is what carbon emissions, that's the word carbon emissions, what it means. And by doing that, we have changed our climate. And in terms of the global target that has been set, trying to keep warming to 1.5 degrees by 2100, we're already at that level of heating. So the current projections are that looking at 2.8 degree increase by 2100. Again, that stats feels so misleading because if I said that to my mum, our global temperature is going to go up 2.8 degrees, she would think, oh, well, today's 20 degrees, tomorrow 22.8 degrees. That seems all right to me. But that 2.8 degrees across the planet means all of the ice in the world melting. It means the level of our oceans going up, et cetera, and all the terrible consequences. So that is why so many climate activists are feeling a sense of depression, despair, which is preventing people from acting. But I want to also provide an antidote to that, which is just to quickly look at some of the major social and political movements and changes that have happened in our world. At the time, they seemed like things that couldn't change. Often they took 10, 20, 30, 40 years to generate the change, but those changes happened. Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream," which is such a powerful statement and a powerful lesson in advocacy. He didn't say, "I have a problem." He said, "I have a dream." He presented a vision of hope and optimism about what could be different. And at the same time, 75% of Americans disapproved of Martin Luther King at the time. He was not university loved, even though we have a holiday for him now. People hated him, people attacked him, and he was killed. And yet he helped galvanize a movement that created major change for America. My next example is a New Zealand one, but I think it applies to Australia as well because the same thing was happening around the same time. The women's suffrage movement in New Zealand started in 1852, succeeded in 1893. You know, it took decades of work by dedicated activists each and every single day. In New Zealand, it meant women over 7 years collecting petition signatures, going door to door. In 1893, and that was hard to do, collect petition signatures at that time, they collected 31,872 signatures over 7 years across 13 separate petitions that were combined into one. Through all of that campaigning and education and advocacy, New Zealand achieved universal suffrage in 1852. It was fiercely resisted. In New Zealand, a campaign to make New Zealand nuclear free started in 1957, and it wasn't until 1984 that that change was legislated. It was a change that was fiercely resisted from all political parties, and yet that change happened. It was started by a few radical people in a living room, and over time it grew to be a mass movement. Often those people that start these type of movements are ridiculed, they're attacked, they're mocked. But for change to happen, for big social change movements, often you need to have those radical disruptors. The Halt All Racist Tours campaign was started in 1969, was successful. This was about, and the New Zealand All Blacks had teams that were made up of Pākehā and Māori, and South Africa didn't want mixed race teams going to South Africa. So a movement started in opposition to this. They would go onto rugby fields and stop rugby matches from happening, which you imagine in New Zealand, rugby is the national sport. It's part of our identity. So having this radical mob come in and stop a rugby match, you can imagine how hated they were. And yet they kept on doing it. And they kept on doing it. They got beaten by the police. They got arrested by the police. But they built a movement for change that helped firstly create that change in New Zealand, but also was helping to build the international case against apartheid in South Africa. So my overall point there is that we need disruptors of the status quo. And sometimes our own personal reaction to disruptors and radical people can be an interesting response. I'm personally not a radical. I'm not going to be chaining myself to a bulldozer or going out to get arrested, but I respect the role that they can play in helping galvanize political movements. In movement theory, there are radicals and rebels. There are change agents who then turn that into more mass mobilization. I would probably position myself in that category. You then have reformers, people who use the political powers and systems to create change. And then you have citizens who help embed that change. History shows us it only takes a few people willing to stand up and disrupt the status quo to ignite a movement. More recently, Greta, in her personal school strike, was a powerful example of this, where that sparked a global school strike for climate movement all over the world. When I do advocacy training, this is a quote that I often use because I feel so empowered by it. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. It's people gathering in their living rooms to create that change that helps happen. And that is partly what gives me hope, is seeing groups of people come together. I'm running a climate advocacy program at the moment, 20 young people who are coming to that class every Monday night to learn how to be campaigners and better advocates, and who are picking up local campaigns and making a difference in their local community that's going to have a broader impact. And one of the things that I talk to them about is a quote from Daniel Hunter's book, Strategy and Soul, where he compares politicians to a balloon tied to a rock, where the politicians will sway from one side to the other. And it's really about movements picking up the rock and shifting the rock, that broader movement building that we have to do to shift what is possible for politicians. So I would say that we need transformational change, not just incremental change. And Anat Shinka-Asoro, who's a message expert, says, I've got 99 problems, don't bring me another problem. So part of the work that we need to do is presenting the hope and the optimism about how we can build a better world as part of preventing that sense of despair. Raymond Williams, who was a socialist writer, said to be truly radical is to make hope possible, not despair convincing. And I think as activists and people that want to see change, we have to remember that. Because without hope, these are my own quotes, without hope, people don't act. Hope is the antidote to inaction. Despair paralyzes, and hope mobilizes. Collectively, we can make a difference. We can prevent the worst from happening. We can build local resilience and community resilience to the change that is coming. And climate actions are good for us, regardless of whether they impact on climate change or not. It's a good thing to have free public transport. It's a good thing to have cycle lanes where people can safely get around their city and build active transport. A lot of the changes that we want in the climate movement are things that are going to be good for people's health and well-being, whether or not they impact on helping the broader issue of climate change. Because we're creating a healthy, fairer, better world, not simply reducing the impact of climate harm, but hopefully we'll be doing that at the same time. And I'll just finish with a quote from a song here in Australia called From Little Things, Big Things Grow, which is a song about Vincent Lingari, who was a change maker himself, and over several years, if you listen to the lyrics of the song, fought for his land to be returned, and he used strategies to do that, and he was patient, and it's a powerful example of how even small actions can have significant broader ramifications. So I might just finish up there, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. Wendy, I'll raise back up to give any thoughts, reflections, questions about Tony's presentation. And Tony, I'll ask you to do the same. Maybe just turn this off.
Thanks, Ian.
Okay.
Thank you, Ian, and thanks so much, Tony. I think we're in furious agreement. I think that coming from different perspectives, which is really important, from different roles in our society, but aligning on some of the same messages is critical. It strikes me. I mean, despair is real. You know, species in Australia, we have the highest species extinction rate in the world. This is not, you know, something that I think not to be despairing about that would be, you know, almost psychopathic. So acknowledging despair and recognising that change needs to happen is fundamental to mobilising the action we need to create regenerative futures. One of my colleagues at Griffith University, Natalie Osborne, has written really powerfully about admitting failure. So, okay, so recognising where we failed, recognising that, giving that its due moment, but then so what? So the title to her paper is, okay, we failed. She's talking about action on climate change and more broadly systemic inequity in society and beyond. But she's saying, so what? And now what? Now what do we do with that acknowledgement? So it's not about being happy clappies into the future. It's about recognising, you know, that we have, you know, forests in Tasmania, the tiny remnant of old growth forests that are still being logged, despite the fact that there are multiple other alternative solutions, recognising these things still need to be, we need to take action on these to create better futures, but finding those bridges to working together to enact change. And I think there are lots of examples already happening of where we're starting to make those inroads. So we are seeing positive examples like, you know, in the work of Jane Goodall, for example, who was a passionate advocate for the survival of the orangutan species. But she, if you listen to her talk, one of the big turning points in her career, she came from a natural science perspective, was to recognise that human insecurity was intimately linked to the survival of the gorilla population, and that it was only by bringing those two questions, you know, those two entities together, by recognising that incredibly impoverished people who had been displaced from their land to create protective areas for, you know, the protection of species. It was only by bringing those different precarities, those different marginalised groups together, that her work really started to make what she says is the sort of impactful change that she would like to see. And I think that that's such a, I often listen to her talking about that because I think on so many levels, my area is looking at cities and urban regions, but on so many levels, it's about the ways in which it's not about environmental protection versus human poverty and precarity, or Indigenous land rights versus, creating a new national park like the Wild Rivers entity in Queensland a decade or so ago. But it's about recognising that there is no climate action that's fair and equitable without engaging sincerely with Indigenous land rights and sovereignty questions. They are not disparate. There is no genuine climate action without recognising that the systemic issues in which we're, embroiled can be picked out and reconfigured. And it's that rebraiding that is so critical to taking action on climate change. So at RMIT, we're really focused at a university scale level on regenerative futures, and why that's been a very powerful bridge builder across our different disciplines. So across the College of STEM, it's probably been the first time that the different colleges and disciplines have been able to come together in a really positive way, more than sustainability or the Sustainable Development Goals were able to do, because despite their, and we can argue the lack of recognition of Indigenous land rights in the Sustainable Development Goals and their UN top-down led agenda, so that's another panel for another time. what regenerative futures does by focusing on the interrelationships and interlinkages between living systems, planetary systems, human systems, and the ways in which these are reconfigured together. It is through that, difficult and complex as that is, it's only by that recognition that we can start to build from where we are, not ignore or disregard the past, but build from where we are to move into more equitable and inclusive futures. And I do see hope around that, not because of the work that different groups are doing at different scales. So I feel like, yes, we are in a very interesting critical climate decade. We are in a time when groups need to take action and need to build bridges together, but we are seeing some of that work happening. But yeah, conversations like this at different scales with different people, like the work that Tony's doing with his community and his advocates, it's critically important, like the groups that we work with as university advocates for the public good. I think that that's critically important. Like Ian reaching out to Tony and I to say, hey, why don't you come in and join this conversation with our community and let's see where these conversations go. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Tony.
I had a few reflections on your presentation, Wendy. One was Rebecca Solnit, and that quote, "Abandoned hope, abandon the future," because I think that aligned very well with what I was saying. I haven't read the book that you referenced, but I have read a different Rebecca Solnit book, which was really important to me personally. So I lived through about 14,000 earthquakes in Christchurch, including the first big one. And I was in the central city in Christchurch when the earthquake happened, which is where the most impact happened. After we evacuated, we never went back to our workplace ever again. The church next to us had collapsed and people died in that church next to us. So it was very traumatic. And I went through some fairly serious depression after the Christchurch, during all of the earthquakes that were ongoing. And I read a book by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell. And I think this is where the power of ideas can be so powerful, because it completely changed my thinking about the experience that I was going through and many of us were experiencing during that recovery period after the earthquakes. And it got me to think more optimistically about the kind of hopeful community that we could build, that we could build a paradise out of a disaster. There was hope and opportunity because there was going to be a rebuild. So it caused me to think very differently, and books and academics can be very powerful in shaping ideas. So I think that's important. And you also spoke a lot about storytelling and the arts and the role I think that music, television, movies, books can have on shifting our thinking and imagining, because creators are people that imagine. And in climate advocacy, I think we have to imagine a different future and present that. Because we, as I mentioned earlier, we can't just present another problem to people, but present that hopeful picture of the future that could be different. And I think in terms of your presentation around local level, place-based community building, I think just to kind of bookend how I started my presentation talking about our community development manager and her sense of despair around the broader global context, that hasn't stopped her from being a change maker, but she's doing it at a very different level, a local grassroots level. So she has led at our community centre a compost hub where 700 residents are registered to drop off their food waste, collecting food waste from cafes and restaurants. And last year, that was 36,000 kilograms of food waste that we prevented from going to landfill. It's just a very local story, but it's a powerful story of community building and climate resilience. We offer a recycling hub to the community of things that are normally difficult to recycle. We provide education to migrants and new refugees in our local community about recycling and about sustainability. So she's still making a significant difference. She's still a change maker, but it is that local place-based level that you were talking about. And I think if we can replicate that in every community and neighbourhood across everywhere, I think those connections and that resilience can help to bring about that broader change as well.
Thank you, Tony. Let's check how we're going online. So it's those online. Time to put your questions. Okay. Somebody asking for titles of the books that you mentioned. Well, Lucy, we'll get them to you as soon as we can. So while people are typing questions into the chat, I'll kick it off. So both of you talked a lot about the importance of different sorts of emotions, particularly hope. But in both your talks, you also talked about despair, anxiety, depression. Neither of you mentioned anger. In research I've been doing over the last few years with colleagues, anger is one of the most potent predictors. So this is research-based, it's not community activism. But when we try to predict people's pro-environmental behaviors, climate-relevant behaviors, of all the emotions we try to measure, anger is always the strongest predictor. But more importantly than that, it also seems to function prophylactically. It prevents depression, it prevents anxiety, it's negatively related to those things. So getting angry about climate change seems to both protect oneself, one's well-being, and motivate behavior. What one is angry about, of course, is a really important question that we're trying to follow up. But I wonder if you've got any reflections on anger and other emotions apart from hope, depression, and so on.
I think you're right. Anger can be a very powerful motivator of change. I spent several years working in the union movement, and part of the movement theory there was anger, hope, action. So that typically motivates a lot of my campaigning is, you get angry about an issue, but then you have to have hope and agency that you can do something about it. And then you need to have specific actions to take action. I know just personally in my own life, when I've been angry about something, I've been much more motivated around that issue. Just for example, I spent several years working to stop pokie machines in communities in New Zealand. I'd build local campaigns all around the country, almost always won, which is sometimes rare in the campaigning field, taking on a very powerful gambling industry who wanted these machines everywhere, particularly in the poorest parts of our community. And whenever they would say something in the media or write a letter to the editor, it would really rile me up, and it would, it's one of the things that would get me out of bed in the morning, was that sense of anger and injustice, and they really pissed me off, to be frank, and it was a motivator, and I was determined to beat them because I knew that if we won our campaigns, that would make our local community a better place. And as a result of those campaigns, New Zealand went from having 26,000 pokie machines to 16,000 pokie machines in the course of 10 years. And that means significantly less gambling harm to individuals and communities. But yeah, it was definitely anger that was one of the things that motivated me. So I wouldn't discount how important that can be. And I think in the climate change space, I think there is and should be a sense of rage about what is happening. Rage at politicians for not acting, rage at big oil and big coal, those companies that are wrecking our planet. There should be anger about that. So yeah, I agree. It's a powerful motivator.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great as a provocation to to other disciplines, and I agree. I think we didn't mention that, and yet it is critical. But it strikes me as like kryptonite, Ian. It's like it's a superpower for mobilising against injustice, for bringing people together, for taking a stand, and it's absolutely essential. And yet, the other side of kryptonite is that it can be devastatingly devastating in too many quantities, fatal, in fact. And we've all seen either in others or in ourselves, where anger can shut people down, it can consume, it can distort and misdirect in some very unhealthy ways. And so yeah, I think that is where you and your colleagues actually could make some really interesting contributions to how that plays out at a community-wide scale, and what happens, as we're seeing in the context of of Gaza, of Ukraine, of the ways. I mean, one of the questions that probably we get asked the most on panels is how can you have any hope for action on climate change when these devastating wars are happening with no obvious solution, either from the UN or within country or from communities on the ground to resolve these? And I think it's a very compelling and powerful, and I have a huge empathy for the anger that is being generated amongst communities in that space. But I do think at some point, like we've seen with 9/11 or any of the travesties in the world, what's happening in the Tarkine again. I just bring it back to redirecting back to our own home case with the few old growth, and I do have a prevalence for the secret life of trees. But I think that if we see trees as the kind of I'd love to have tree-centered cities. But if we can't just not be angry about what's happening, where it doesn't seem to be reasonable, where there are other options on the table, where through blindness, siloedness, greed, the fetish, all of the fetishes of human society in its darkest form, we need a response to that. But the response is not going to be to match that kind of inhumanity, that kind of ugliness, that violence, emotional violence that happens in the world. So I think, for me anyway, as a pacifist, trying to move even the violence of anger to the empowerment of being angry about an unjust situation is the only way that I can respond to that at this moment, Ian. Thanks.
Really important reflections. So anger alone is inadequate, insufficient, always has to be coupled with a sense of self-efficacy. It needs to be channeled or channelized in a jargony sort of way. Otherwise, it can indeed become quite toxic and corrosive. So I have a couple of questions online. So Winifred kicks us off. Thanks very much for your talks. I'll ask you to reflect on Thanks, David. Can you scroll back up, or is
Can we hear from them, or do people prefer to answer questions more intense?
If we'd ask you, could you reflect on how community responses to the climate crisis will be affected by other aspects of the polycrises? Crises such as growing food insecurity, international and interstate conflict, and biodiversity loss. One question. And two, how groups can shift to anticipate this. Seems to me that as the crisis gets worse, people will be less able individually and collectively to respond. And I'm going to think about how this dynamic can be combated. So, two pretty meaty questions there. I don't know if anybody wants to leap to their feet.
I might just answer the second question. I think a lot of people in the climate space are transitioning now to having more conversations about community resilience building, and it's about building resilience to the impacts that we know are starting to happen and will come. So example of this, yesterday at the Yarra Council, they are trialling a board game where it's called the adaptation game. So it's about adapting to the impacts of climate change. And they go through scenarios where You go 4 years into the future, the Earth is heated by 1.8 degrees. What does that mean? They read out some possible newspaper headlines, and then they give you the first shock. And the first shock is they will overlay on your local map in front of you, the Yarra Council area, the impact of a flood. And then you work together as individuals and community about how do you respond to that flood in terms of community resilience. And then they go forward another 4 years into the future and they present another shock, which is a heat emergency. So it's trying to start the conversation and build community resilience to the shocks that we know are to come. And I know a lot of that work is happening throughout communities. At a neighbourhood house, we are cooperating with 9 other neighbourhood houses to build a climate action and resilience plan. And it's about building resilience to our physical infrastructure of our own neighbourhood houses, building resilience to physical infrastructure as a community, but also building social resilience. How can we be resilient in terms of bringing communities together so that you can respond in a disaster, that you know the vulnerable members in your community who you can phone up and say, are you okay? Check in on them. So I think a lot more of that work is happening in communities in recognition that we are going to expect more heat emergencies, more serious kind of weather events. And we need to have communities that can be resilient to that.
Right, follow up on that a little bit, sorry. So you had a slide, Tony, about I can't remember what percentage food production is going to be affected by water.
50% in the next 25 years.
If you take that as the shock that a community has to plan resilience to, it's a pretty severe shock. Is that within the talents of a community to be able to do that?
I mean, that is, yeah, it's a huge question. And I think also the reality is there's a global inequity to that shock, because I suspect it's probably not people in Australia who are going to be most severely impacted by that. It's people who are in the poorest part of the world who are already struggling in terms of water and food. And that then raises lots of questions around climate refugees, Australia's policy around, given it's the rich world that has caused this problem, it's not the poor parts of the world that have caused the problem. Are we going to open up our country to more climate refugees that are seeing the impacts in our own neighbourhood in the Pacific Islands as water levels start to rise? Are we going to increase our refugee quota to take more people? So there's policy implications around things like that before even getting into security and global conflict that might result from all of this. There's a whole nother topic, so I might not answer that.
Yeah. But I might pick up on that because what you're talking about is migrations without nations, whether they be from climate refugees or from, as we know, species like whale corridors and others have never adhered to the sort of administrative boundaries that we've put in place. And what's really interesting about the shared frameworks that we're using collectively as we move into this critical decade is the ways in which they're shifting. And that's hopeful, I think. So just last month, there was the big gathering around the Intergenerational Futures Summit, and there were lots of roundtables around the world at different levels, from universities to community groups, that fed into that Intergenerational Futures Summit. And a large message that came out of that was the need for safe and just futures. The safe and just futures, safe planetary boundaries which allow us all to inhabit this earth, but also a just and equitable and inclusive way of addressing that. So it's not neo-colonial, neo-fascist, neo-imperial ways of moving forward where only the rich and privileged and the few get to survive on an unstable earth. And I think that this is really critical because, we had the Brundtland Report, which really put in motion sustainable development. And the good thing about sustainable development and the emphasis on the precautionary principle and intergenerational futures was the need to balance ecological, economic and social priorities together to create sustainability. But what that actually looks like in practice, of course, was almost impossible because they're so abstract and vague, and what balance means, it is very different. So in a way, it was great because everyone could buy into it without actually having to enact very much because the term was so broad. So the Sustainable Development Goals sought to address that by addressing the cry for more specificity. So they came up with the 17 different goals to try and flesh out what do we mean by, ecological, economic and social and how they interact. But then they were critiqued in and of themselves, even though we're still in the 2030 agenda, because they were too siloed, they were too complicated, they were focused around quantitative indicators, they were nation-based. So they themselves have been. So now what we've seen emerge in the last 10 years, I apologise, this is a very brief and potted history of large frameworks, but now what we're seeing is efforts to bring together the work around Earth system science and planetary boundaries, which are showing us that we're overshooting all of the fundamental areas that we need to be safe on this planet. So climate change, but also, water quality, soil acidification, and the list goes on. But they've embedded, so Kate Rayworth, an alternative economist, has embedded in her donut economics model the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which seek to speak to the interplay of sustainable indicators within the planetary boundaries framework. And so what's important, and moving forward, this is becoming actually very, it's becoming very influential, is that people are starting to recognise the complexity of what the questioner is asking, that in fact these can't be assessed. There's no point having a safe planet if there are no people, if we've got mass poverty, mass hunger, wars, etc. And likewise, there's no point having a safe and just, humane, human society if the planet has crumbled around us. So Bruno Latour, around the time that Trump came in his last iteration, wrote about going back to Earth. And he said we've been trapped in the 20th century between seeking to move from the local through to the global. But we found that actually globalisation didn't give forth the promises that and in fact it was very unjust and unevenly distributed across the planet in so many ways for humans and non-human species. And now, and this is the message of Regenerative Futures, we're trying to get back to Earth, which recognises the fundamental need for equitable living systems that actually function, and so people and planet can live and dwell well together. So that's a long answer, I'm sorry, to the question.
That's great. And Winifred, if you have any follow-ups, maybe put your hand up or about more questions there. The next question from Angie Bone, about balancing the speed with which we need to act with the critical need for justice and inclusion, and the time community mobilisation takes, noting especially what you made, Tony, that these have a half-life of decades.
Yeah. I think what I would say there is it's important to already look at the incredible movements that have been built, because we're not starting from zero here. There are amazing campaign organisations, I know, across Australia and New Zealand in particular. There are big climate movements, and other organisations like GetUp that are very active in the climate action space. There are movements like the Climate Youth Coalition, the Tomorrow Movement. There are lots of different organisations that are campaigning in the space of generating change, whether it's stopping new coal and gas exploration from being approved, whether it's the Australian Conservation Foundation that are campaigning for our forests and our animals. We do have movements that exist. We have capacity. So I'd say we're not starting from zero. There's obviously more work to do. And I think part of what I wanted to communicate in my presentation was I think there is a sense of fatigue and despair amongst some in the climate activism space, and how corrosive that can be and how we have to protect against it. By presenting a sense of hope that we can make change, that we have advocacy, whether it's working in our local community or whether it's advocating to politicians to make more systemic change. I think there is capacity already built that we can utilise and take advantage of and build on.
Yeah, I love your examples, Tony. This is a critical question about how we see, can democracy be saved? Actually, it's a really tricky one, because we've seen with calls from the from the radical green left and others, which I'm very in favour of. Famous book in Melbourne was Code Red, for example. It came out of the Friends of the Earth movement that was calling for, we know that we can mobilise quickly in times of war, for example. We bring in special legislation that fast tracks initiatives to attend to matters of urgency, especially in the national interest. And so there's been calls for a long time from environmentalists saying we need to fast track these, specific legislations to address climate change. And I am reasonably empathetic to that, except that, of course, there are also the precautions of democratic process and due diligence. That's good if everyone acts in a fair, equitable and progressive way. That's extremely dangerous if what it means is the process becomes opaque, if there's not transparency, if we have autocrats that are deciding our futures. And I think this is in weather of mass destruction, this is a real challenge, and that double-sided sword of how to act quickly but still be democratic, which I think is really important, so that we don't see replicated the injustices of the past, is fundamentally where there is not enough work being done. And I think it needs, psychologists, sociologists, it needs the whole range of disciplinary perspectives to what is the social contract around how we can act democratically to address climate change. And it's surprisingly thin on the ground in terms of how we address those competing sustainability criteria. Just wanted to quickly attend to one of the questions about walkability and how we see this on the ground. And I think what's important about that, walkable cities for those of us in the urban research community, it's part of public transport, it's part of transitioning away from dirty coal. It's key to reconnecting with non-human environments, so being more attentive to our own beautiful flora and fauna, re-engaging community and the familiarity of who's who in your local neighbourhood. So it's a critical linchpin. But where it loses traction, I think, with communities is when it's not cognizant of what some of the needs of the community are. So where it comes from privileged backgrounds, where there are lots of public transport options, where there are lots of parks and walkable spaces, it gets more support. Where it needs to build more bridges is to marginalised communities who aren't benefiting from our current social structures, and we need to do better at that. And I think planners particularly have a role there, and policymakers to make those connections and be those advocates for equitable change.
I'll just quickly touch on the walkable cities one, because I think it's a really interesting example. I think partly there, I would look at examples in the world where it's happened, because there are places, I think, in parts of Spain and parts of Europe where they have transitioned to community and removed a highway, or they've created a greener, more walkable, livable city. So you could present that as an example and say, all of those challenges existed there, and yet they did it. So let's have a conversation together about how they did it, how they're able to take a car-dominant location and turn it into a walkable, incredible space, and have that conversation. Because I think sometimes it's, not being able to imagine what it looks like where will my car go? Where will I park? All those kind of things. But there's multiple solutions around public transport and all sorts of things. I'll let you go. And then I might there was another thought that disappeared out of my brain.
I take all your points. It's more like, as an activist, presenting that vision is really important, but it almost, to me, needs to be a mental model where you explain to people what it would be like to live in that new world. And so they sort of do need some level of detail that sometimes I don't feel like I can provide. And so I was just wondering, how detailed does this vision need to be to sort of like come to life and have the like effective force that it needs to if we don't have the domain specific knowledge to sort of convey that? Something that I've struggled with, like when you're talking about how like outer communities might not sort of get on board with the walkable city scene, like that's such a fair point. And for them, because they're, you know, what's it called? What's a urban sprawl, it might not make sense for them to have that structure. It's just how do you work backwards when things are sort of already set in stone? So I was wanting to know like how detailed does this vision need to be?
It's an awesome question. And the reason I jumped up is I've just spent 6 months in Barcelona, which is sort of, you know, often talked about as being a leading light in terms of urban action on climate change. And in many ways it is. And the super blocks particularly, or the superia, where they sought to create, you know, large blocks of walkability, also for civic engagement and redirect the mobility questions to a more sustainable public transport model, are a great example of the pros and cons of how that impacts communities and the politics that happened in Barcelona. So Salvador Ruelli, who was the chief architect behind that, his vision was for that to be equitably rolled out across the whole of Barcelona city. But what happened, of course, is that they had a couple of key test sites which became very quickly gentrified and also polarised some of the community around some of the walkability issues, which doesn't mean, as Tony mentioned, like it's really important to see some of these visionary ideas and the ways in which they're being rolled out in specific contexts. Barcelona having already a very old and well-established built form in context. It wasn't like building a new super block somewhere else. But, you know, Marco Marti, my colleague, and others have been really invested in working with Australian city local councils as to how we can start to look at that within the Australian context and what that might mean for fundamentally rethinking public transport structures and thinking, which is so needed. And Paul Meese, you know, way back as sort of, you know, was such an advocate, and Crystal Legacy and others are building on that work. So, yeah, these are hopeful examples, I think. Yeah.
It's a really interesting and challenging question. I might talk to you about it more offline, but I think there's also some really real examples of this conversation. So here in Melbourne, on just Sydney Road, there is a big campaign to try to completely change Sydney Road. It's a major highway, unfortunately, so that's the big barrier. So the state government doesn't want to change it. But there are visions that have been presented that could completely transform Sydney Road. The trams are not accessible, so a lot of people with disability have been campaigning to have disability accessible trams. Cyclists have been killed because it's very unsafe to cycle down Sydney Road. And yet when the new trains get built, when they remove the level crossings, a lot of people are going to be forced onto Sydney Road, which is unsafe at the moment. A lot of activists want to have just one lane of traffic instead of two, and then widen the footpaths, have tree plantings. So there is a really powerful positive vision there. There's also lots of barriers. A lot of the street shop owners don't want their car parking removed because they're worried that it means their shops, people won't shop at their shops. But even though there's research showing that actually if people are able to walk and cycle around the community, that they're probably going to benefit as shops, but they don't see that. They just worry people won't be able to park outside their shop. And then there's the barriers around it being designated as a major highway. But this is a campaign that's been going for about 4 or 5 years. I think it will succeed at some point. It's a campaign that's my local community, so it's probably a campaign I'm going to jump on board with at some point as well, because I think it's a really important thing to do, to create a street that is safe for, you know, people pushing prams and for people walking around and for cycling, and just creates a much better local community as well. So I think that's just one very real example of how something as simple as wanting a walkable neighbourhood and streets has lots of other complex kind of issues attached to it. And it's about working through all of those things in a campaign context.
Just want to give a quick example from Brisbane. Just for colleagues at the University of Queensland or Brisbane, a great example of that is South Bank. So South Bank was going to be all high-rise developments, privately owned, right up to the river. And it was only because of the activism of Phil Haywood at QUT and a coalition of activist groups in Brisbane, mainly from West End and the surrounds, where they said, look, this is a unique opportunity post-Expo 88 to have this as public space, walkable space, green space that could be for the whole of the community. And so that was a hard-fought battle, but one of the sort of rare examples in Australia of where that was very successful. But then when it was enacted, people critiqued it for being, very privileged, very white, that it wasn't inclusive, it wasn't a diverse space. And so then it had a whole different range of critiques that it had to navigate. And I haven't been living in Brisbane for a decade or more now, so I would have to defer to colleagues living in Brisbane to know whether they think it's been a successful addition. But just from a climate change point of view, as green lungs in the city, it certainly is better than a whole suite of privileged private developments, that's for sure.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left. There's a couple of questions in the chat, plus Winifred posted a reply to what you were giving in response, Tony, to Winifred's earlier question. So the questions, the theme cutting across Winifred's response and I think Angie's post, and has come up a number of times so far, is around justice, equity, and sorry, this is not the words you use, Winifred, but I take part of that reply that she's posted there as pointing to how do we collectively carve up a public budget when we've got to devote more and more and more to disaster preparedness, response, mitigation, yet also need to invest an awful lot in developing new social infrastructures and decarbonising our economy. It's a justice question, equity question as much as anything else. I think it's sort of how do we deal with the competition for the scarce dollars that is needed, that are needed to drive changes that we need. Apologies, Winifred, if I'm doing a disservice there. So I guess it's an invitation to both maybe to pick up on justice. Yeah.
I'm honestly not sure how to answer that question. I share the concern. I'm not sure what the solution is. I mean, my hope would be that in the work to build resilient communities that are prepared, that we're also kind of connecting the dots between members of the community. And the thing that I'm passionate about is then taking those communities to the next step, which is then getting them to advocate for political and systemic change. So having built a community that's connected and resilient, then sharing with them tools to advocate for broader systemic change. That would be my hope, I think. Whether it's realistic, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a big question that goes to the heart of city planning and politics, but I think what's being recognised is catalyst projects that can do multiple tasks at the same time. So that are part of the disaster and resilience building in natural disaster contexts, but are also equitable and fair in terms of, say, green space provision or affordable housing and other areas like that. So I think when we're seeing one-off pet projects that are clearly not in the public interest, I think that's definitely going in the wrong direction. But even in the public interest is a very contested idea. So in Melbourne, we've seen severe flooding in the Maribyrnong area. Do we need in the future to protect a horse racing facility over and above, other initiatives that could be, for the benefit of the whole community? These are some of the politics of discernment. You could call it a politics of discernment moving forward. What do we want to hold on to and support and move forward with? But where do we need to make sometimes some hard choices about things that we need to let go of now if we're moving into a more regenerative future? And that happens at all sorts of different scales, from the city through to neighbourhoods, through to the national and international level.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to follow up about mental models sort of things or no? Okay.
We can talk.
Sorry?
We can talk
Okay.
about the question.
I think the last newish question here is from D. McDonald. Is that Diana? I'm not sure. Hello. The longer things take to change, the more time there is for misinformation to gain a hold. For example, challenges to recent movement, or example, the recent movements against renewable energy infrastructure. So there's a particular question there, but let me scope it out and broaden it a little bit more and make the obvious point that change is never unidirectional, is never constant and consistent in its pace. There's always a lot of things happening, and you make kind of step changes and then you get pulled back because it's always contested and there's friction and inertia and everything else. And possibly, arguably, misinformation is an example of one a force of resistance to change. Perhaps you could address the question in the broader context of the smoothness or the ebb and flow of change that's needed here.
I'm still running my answer. Yeah, I mean, I think actually, Ian, you've responded to that really well. Like, I can think of a number of examples here in Victoria around the energy infrastructure debates. But part of those are coming from communities who feel that some of their basic needs aren't being met, whilst infrastructure that they're actually not participating in is being prioritised. And so disenfranchised communities can then react by saying, look, this isn't addressing the priorities. So I think that having those community-based conversations that are then linked to the political processes that distribute resources fairly amongst diverse communities is really important. So, at the moment, we want to encourage shifting away from, shifting towards alternative modes other than petrol or diesel-based cars. And yet, the rollout of that is uneven. And not everyone is able to partake in that journey at the same pace. So maybe it's looking at across. If we just look at public, transport, which is a key area, but it's also, you can't unpack transport from people's affordable housing and the modes in which they are able to connect their lives and their aspirations for a better future for their children. So public transport. So that's why I always default back to a public realm, public transport, public parks and, public libraries, public facilities, because if you start there, then it's for everyone. And then from there, you layer on things that, are in that, those different gear changes. So.
Misinformation and disinformation is a significant challenge, especially with the development of artificial intelligence and generating fake audio and fake video. I think this is a much broader challenge that we have to address. There is an Australian book from last year called Facts and Other Lies by Ed Cooper, which is a very good book. The challenge with the book is there's not a lot of solutions about how we can handle it, but it starts to touch on some possible solutions. One critical thing is how we respond to fake information and misinformation. A couple of thinkers, so George Lakoff, who wrote Don't Think of an Elephant, and also Anat Shenker-Osorio, American communications thinkers and experts talk about not spreading misinformation, and even myth busting spreads the misinformation because you're repeating the lie, you're repeating the misinformation. So it's important to kind of reframe and use your own language and use the fact rather than correct the misinformation. Otherwise, that's one of the ways that misinformation spreads is people outraged by it, share it, and they spread it. So being very careful about how we respond is one thing. So Anat Shinker has actually done work in Australia as well. So she did a lot of work around people seeking asylum. And just as one example, she gave in the activist community, people would say seeking asylum is not illegal. And they repeat that, seeking asylum is not illegal. Seeking asylum is not illegal. But most people don't hear the word not. So all they're hearing is seeking asylum is illegal. That's what people hear. So using the word, using not in messaging can be very damaging and should be avoided. So there are examples and research out there about how we can start to respond to misinformation and disinformation, but it is a very significant challenge.
Thank you, Tony. Just on that last point, one of our colleagues here, John Cook, who's a global expert on misinformation, has, with some of his international colleagues, Steve Lewandowski, Sander van der Linden, and others, done some research that tackles that question of whether myth busting actually reproduces the myth in a dangerous way, and shows no, that a piece of misinformation left unchallenged is much more damaging longer term than correcting it, even though the correction involves kind of reproducing the misinformation.
Yeah, but you should correct it using a fact sandwich.
Yes.
So yeah, there's a way to correct it.
There are ways of doing these things. Yeah. So that brings us to the end. I just had one other free association in my head. When you were talking about the adaptation game, Tony, which I need to go and hunt out now because I haven't seen it, reminded me of when I was much younger, still in graduate school, came across a board game developed by a political scientist called Bertel Ollman. The game's called Class Struggle. And he developed it as a counter to monopoly and the dangerous lessons that children learn about free market enterprise and competition from playing Monopoly, and the myth that Monopoly enshrines because everybody starts equal. And so in Class Struggle, Ollman's a noted Marxist scholar, published a great book called Alienation. But you start that game by throwing what he calls the genetic die, and the number that it lands on basically assigns you to a class, to a social position, a social status. And you either have a huge amount of wealth that you're born into, privilege, or you're born into an impoverished situation or somewhere in between. And so you start the game unevenly, and so you have to compete unevenly, unequally, and it was developed to illustrate the real world living in a capitalist economy, or neo-capitalist economy. But it's unfortunately so complicated. I've tried playing it several times over the years with friends and invested 2 or 3 hours at a time and never got very far with it. And that kind of strikes me as a metaphor, picking up on what you were saying about metaphors. This is what real social change is like. It is difficult. The rules are complicated and messy. If in fact you can find the rules at all. I'm not sure where that metaphor is going. George Lakoff wrote another great book called Women, Fire and Dangerous Things, which is just an amazing title. On behalf of everybody online and a few people who've braved the horrible weather in Melbourne to show up here in person, thank you both, Wendy and Tony, for fascinating presentations, stimulating, provocative, and especially for the insights in the Q&A. I really appreciate your your contributions. So thank you very much. And thanks everybody online for attending, for your questions. And Christine, I think, will circulate a link to a recording in due course. So thank you very much, everyone.